According to a report by the G20 Research Group, South Africa has come number last in an assessment of the compliance of G20 members with key commitments they made at their previous summit, which was held in Rome last year. Now, the priority commitments range from broad macroeconomic goals, such as strengthening the long-term financial resilience, greater vaccine equity, and efforts to combat climate change. For reaction on this, we're joined now by Business Unity South Africa President, Professor Bonang Mohale. Dr. Mohale, thank you very much for your time. Firstly, is this a fair assessment, given that South Africa is the only African nation on that group of 20 countries, and these are first world countries, might we add? So, is this a fair assessment on the part of South Africa?
I think the only way to establish whether it's fair or not is to look at the journey and therefore the evolution. South Africa in the last 10 to 15 years has been holding global records for all the wrong reasons. We are now the most unequal society in the world, the country with the highest unemployment rate in the world, the country with the highest SME failure rate in the world, the country with the highest GBV rate in the world, not by a factor of 2, but 10 times the global average. And then lastly, second only to Russia in terms of suicide rates in the world. So for me, this is another confirmation that as a people with great natural endowments, we have not been awake to. Lastly, the one that's more important for me is that it comes at the worst possible time. This is indeed a bleak time for the global economy, where the world is undergoing tectonic quake, where there is huge regime shift, where there is worldwide slowdown, economic slowdown. I'm talking about confirming that it is troubled neighborhood we are in, not with one, but multiple crises, as the world moves away from this notion of financial stability, of predictable financial markets, of low interest rates and low inflation, to a new world that is characterized by exogenous shocks, where there is increased unpredictability, increased volatility. And this is precipitated for me by, in the interest of time, only 3 out of 10 global challenges. Of course, the pandemic, which is still with us, but this notion of an unprovoked, unwarranted, and therefore unjustified Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and then climate change. The confluence, the intersectionality of those 3 has now led to Europe experiencing an energy crisis precipitated by rapidly increasing oil and food prices. And we see it evidenced by a number of things from where we are sitting. So for me, number one is, of course, there's a global recession, there is supply chain constraints, there is labor shortages globally, there is fuel and food price increases, there is double-digit inflation for the first time probably in 20 years, but also increasing interest rates. The global GDP is less than 2.7%, in South Africa 1.9%, if we do everything right, but also increasing borrowing costs for governments, for business, but also for individuals. We are getting into a 5th wave of public debt crisis, but also increasing global commodity prices and therefore reduced incomes that will then lead to probably eroding household purchasing power, giving us a cost of living crisis, increased poverty levels, increased social tensions that we see not only in South Africa, but also where 123 million people just in sub-Saharan Africa are experiencing acute food insecurity. The solution for me is probably two major things. There's an urgent need for fiscal consolidation. The Americas and European countries are now reviewing their economic policies. Lastly, I think this notion of a just energy transition, amongst others, is being seen as the best chance to return to growth in years to come.
Yeah. Prof, I'm going to come to you in a moment on the statement that you made, that for a country with a wealth of endowments, and I will ask the question around what it is that South Africa could have leveraged or can still leverage on. But let's quickly deal with the increasing borrowing costs. We are already a country that is seen as having been downgraded to junk status by ratings agencies. There is the anticipated grey listing. Hopefully, we can avoid it. But I want to focus the attention there, that South Africa, particularly on issues of crime, corruption, and money laundering in particular, I mean, this morning, it absolutely is shocking that Israel's most wanted gang leaders could only be found here in South Africa. Why is it that this country has become a hub for criminals? Can we avoid that grey listing with such issues?
You see, you hit the nail on the head, because it says we have 1,001 challenges, often with conflicting priorities. We started well as a democracy. 2007, on the way to Polokwane, the wheels came off. Evidence by 2009, all the matrices were pointing in the wrong direction. So how does it show up? One, inequality is widening. Racism is at an all-time high. Black graduates are roaming the streets hopelessly. Public education has collapsed. Since when is 30% an acceptable mark? Public health care continue to fail the poor and the vulnerable. Crucial infrastructure is laying in decay, and lawlessness has now become an epidemic. We now have new nomenclature. Load shedding, we should call it what it is, blackouts. Because can you believe, it's actually incredulous, that of the 28 years of democracy, more than half of that was spent in the dark, because the first rolling blackouts were in February of 2008. That was 14 and a half years ago, and yet we haven't been able to fix this. If anything, we are now losing generation capacity at an alarming rate. And we know that electricity is the fourth means of production, when land is the primary means of production. So each time the lights go off, stage 6, we lose up to 6 billion rands a day. 2, between stages is 500 million. We wipe off an entire GDP in just a year. You spoke about our borrowing costs. Pre-COVID, we were borrowing at a rate of 2.1 billion a day every day. Our debt today is 5 trillion South African rands. Our debt servicing costs have exceeded 300 billion, which means just on interest alone, we're paying more than 1 billion a day.
All right.
We are now rapidly approaching the 20% mark of GDP that is just going to interest rate.
Prof, I'm out of time, so I'm going to squeeze these two questions in one. What are these endowments that South Africa can leverage on in order to at least put us in good stead? But also, finally, the Nasrec conference. How big an albatross is it on our economy?
Joe, I thought you'll end with easy questions. So the endowment, this is where it's very sad. Africa is the only continent where the sun shines more than 300 days a year. And yet the World Authority on Solar Energy is Germany, with about 90 days of sunshine. God given, we're not using it. We even have cities named windy cities, where we are blessed with winds, and we could use wind power for electricity generation. On land, like Tebeja and East London, but also in the middle of the sea, where we can even use wave technology. One of the few countries in the world that is ensconced between two oceans. Lastly, 3 of the mighty rivers in the world are found here, including the mighty Zambezi, so hydroelectric power. But why is it that we talk about energy poverty? 2 days ago, we reached 8 billion global population. Of the 1.4 billion people without any form and access to energy whatsoever, 642 million of them are found in Africa. By the way, that's not why we are called the dark continent. So as I end, Africa is not a poor continent, just poorly managed, because every single solitary one of the metals that the world needs, not just once, it's not found here as number 22 and number 25, but either number 1 or number 2. But we don't determine the price. We let other people determine that price. Lastly, what happens in the December ANC elective conference? So it happens at a time when there's a big pall and a dark cloud hanging over this once glorious, beautiful movement. 2, irrespective of the outcome, all we know is that in 2024, in the national election, this ANC-led government will celebrate if they get below 50%. Because in the last local elections, not only did they receive below 50%, but they lost all the metropolitans. That's 60% of the economic activity. Imagine how we have squandered the 72% majority that we were gifted by Thabo Mbeki and the 2/3 majority that we were given by our first democratically elected president, Nelson Mandela.
Professor Bonang Mohale, thank you very much for your time. President of Business Unity, South Africa.